Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Removing the Confederate statues, Graceland plans for an arena, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by a roundtable of journalists, starting with Michaela Watts, High Ground News. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
Bill Dries, a senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for being here. And Burnell Smith, publisher of the New Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here.
Always good to be here.
Absolutely. So we start with the monuments, the statues. Maybe we'll just start with some of the basics, and I'll turn to you, Bill, in terms of where we are with the mayor's office, the city council, some of the logistics and the politics and who has control over these statues, and we'll get into some of the bigger issues and the protests and so on.
Right. Mayor Jim Strickland continues to pursue a strategy of trying to get a waiver from the Tennessee Historical Commission, and if that doesn't work, then for the city to go to Chancery Court to get the removal of this. This is a process that the city council's attorney, Alan Wade, this week told the city council is more difficult than carrying out a lethal injection in Tennessee, an execution. So the council seems to have some different ideas about this, and their first discussion of this as a group this week centered around making the case that the statues are a public nuisance and should at least be covered up, or that they violate a specific civil rights statute in Tennessee law that guarantees all citizens the right of enjoyment of public facilities. So the council's still talking, it hasn't acted yet. They'll discuss this again after Labor Day. So that's kind of where officialdom is. Meanwhile, the protest about this, the Take Them Down 901 movement that has called for the immediate removal or covering up of the statues. We've had the first arrest in those protests. 6 people arrested a week ago as the show airs in Health Science Park, which is where the Nathan Bedford Forrest Monument is.
And we've got police stationed at all the monuments, I believe, because of
that one and
protests.
the Jefferson Davis monument.
The Jefferson Davis and the Fourth Bluff Park. I lose track of the names, but the park downtown. It was interesting, Burnell, I'll turn to you. The council seems to be wanting to move more aggressively. I think some people have criticized Strickland is not moving fast enough. He said his hands are tied and he's moving as fast as he can in terms of going through the Historic Commission and going the legal process. And we'll get, he had quite, particularly for Jim Strickland, kind of an outburst this week over some of the criticism. He has said for years that he wants these monuments to come down. Was it in 2013, am I right, that the legislature removed the cities? Is that give or take? When the legislature interceded because there was movement to take them down back then,
right.
And said cities across the state can't do that. They got the parks renamed before the legislature acted, but they weren't able to take them down. But again, your thoughts. The council seems to be looking at all options and potentially quicker, more aggressive options.
Exactly, and I think the point that the mayor has made is to make sure that there is a legal process that's non-challengeable, if you will. I don't think there is a path though that will not result in some sort of challenge or lawsuit. There are parties on both sides of this issue, and I think ultimately that however it plays out, because clearly there's momentum not only here locally but across the country to remove these kinds of emblems and statues. So I think it'll happen, but there will still be some challenge. So I think it's important the way the council is moving to expedite the process and get this thing behind me. I think people have looked at cities like New Orleans, where they've recently removed those kinds of statues in their community, but they understand that behind that was a 2-year process that it took to actually get to that point. So, I think there's some heavy lifting that has to be done to make sure that it's done in a way that's not challengeable and that is legally defensible.
Right. And well, let me get Michaela, your thoughts. You were at the protest, I believe, right? This last weekend.
Yes,
your thoughts on the protests and the argument.
Well, the protest was, as you can imagine, very, very, very emotionally charged. And the frustration amongst this civic group, Take 'em Down 901, is really getting to a boiling point. And we're seeing that boiling point because, as Bernard noted, yes, New Orleans took a couple of years for that plan to go through. But the city of Memphis has been involved in this process really since 2013, and it's been one step forward at a time. You know, it started with renaming our parks to take away ties to the Confederacy, and then it went to the waiver that was turned down by the Tennessee Historical Commission, and then Alan Wade noted that the Tennessee Historical Commission failed to properly adapt criteria under the Tennessee Heritage Protection Act. So that slip up on their end enabled Memphis to start this process over again. Now, in my work, and I've done a lot of talking with the leaders of Take 'em Down 901, and their solid point is, look, you know, it's obviously going to result in legal action either way. Right. Go ahead and pull the trigger, get these statues down, and if it invites a lawsuit from the state of Tennessee, then so be it. Go ahead and just get them out, get them done. So certainly frustration on their side.
Right. And what is Strickland? I mean, if let's just say for a second, if the mayor said, I'm going to order them taken down tonight, what is the action that can be taken against a mayor for breaking the law, a state law? I mean,
if it were to be, we've just decided to take them down and not citing any real reason for it other than that they are offensive to a good number of Memphians, he could possibly be open to an ouster suit. Any citizen could say the mayor has failed to follow the laws of the state of Tennessee, and therefore he should be ousted from office. That law's been in existence for over 100 years and was actually used on E.H. Crump when he was mayor in 1915 for refusing to enforce prohibition. But I think the council discussion this week makes it clear that wherever the action comes from, whether it's the mayor's office or the council's office, that the city is going to put forward some kind of legal reasoning for why the monument should come down or should be covered up. If not, at the end of this very lengthy, drawn-out process under the Heritage Act, then under some other kind of legal proceeding on a much quicker basis.
What is the reaction? I was sort of fascinated, I mean, personally, by the idea of covering them up. And what has the reaction among the protest groups been?
Well, you know,
is that enough?
I think that's a first step. I mean, I think it has gotten to a point where this issue has boiled up and boiled over to a point where there's immediate action warranted and demanded by the protesters, and certainly the arrests that have come has sort of escalated this now to a whole new level. But you know, at the base end, there's a couple of components of it. One is, you know, let's be real. There's a celebration of acknowledgement of people who really essentially tried to overthrow the government. So what government, you know, continues to uphold treasoners in that way? And then of course, if you understand that, you know, you have the Grand Wizard, the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, that has a statue in the middle of a city that's 70% African American. It is certainly offensive to the majority of the population in our community, and this is not a new fight. I mean, I think a lot of people have tried to couch this in the sense that, you know, well, all of a sudden. Well, if you look back historically, this has been an ongoing sort of battle that has had ebbs and flows that were based in legal maneuvers, and so that's why we're still here in 2017. But there has been an effort for years and years, for decades now, to try to remove these emblems.
Well, I remember when Auction Avenue was renamed, and I had lived in Memphis, I don't know how long. I honestly had never thought about. That's the name of a street. It's Auction Avenue. I didn't realize what it was commemorating until it was changed to A.W. Willis Bridge, and that street was renamed, and so it's interesting. It's interesting, this whole process. It also somehow, all this evokes for me the whole lynching sites movement of people trying to mark the and I'm just drawing a blank on the name of the El Person, who's the lynching site that was marked along the new Wolf River Greenway, and there are other sites that will be marked, and commemorate is not the right word, but a
To
horrific
acknowledge the
period
history.
of Southern American history.
Right. That's sort of been swept under the rug in many instances and not acknowledged. You know, the point is that there are some things that have to be corrected.
This I think also is really exhibit A in the larger point, and that is that we are at a point of generational political change in Memphis. This is certainly not a new issue, but there are new voices that are speaking out on this, and they are impatient voices simply because this has been such a long discussion about actually doing something in which nothing has happened. And you also have people who are new to the political process and as a result are distrustful of it. And they may actually agree in some cases with the idea of going through the waiver process, but they feel like they have to be in the park and there have to be protests continuing simply to keep pressure on it so that what happens here isn't what has happened over the last 40 years.
I think Bill makes a very good point about the change in climate and the tone and tenor of millennial focused protesters, is that there's not this level of patience and there's a high level of distrust with leadership, because historically you look back and say, well, this fight has been going on, but it's resulted in the same, you know, in the same thing happening.
The monuments are
still there. Well, have we heard from people who want to keep them up? Have there been counter protests? Have there been politicians who've come forward and said, "Hey, I'm opposed to taking them down"? You hear that, you see that in nationally, obviously.
Nobody has come out. The Sons of Confederate Veterans did their annual commemoration of Forrest Birthday several weeks ago in the park. That was pretty strictly limited to the birthday commemoration. There were no comments from the podium about the monuments controversy, but it was certainly present there.
Sure.
Right.
And at most events, because we have seen an enormous amount of civic response just in the last week since Charlottesville. And so what I've noticed reporting at every single protest or rally, there's always some, people who would prefer that these monuments stay in place. They tend to stay sort of in the back of the crowds. But Eric, to your point about covering up the statues, I think it's important to note that Saturday's kind of pandemonium that broke out was in response to two protesters attempting to cover up the statue. That's when everything started to get really, really chaotic. So what I've observed is at this point, covering up the statue would relieve some of this pressure, I believe, because we're seeing this dynamic play out. We're seeing tension rise between Mayor Strickland and between Take 'em Down 901. We're not seeing them at the same table. And while I don't think covering up is a satisfactory into a means to an end for them, I do think a gesture would go a long way at this point.
And I've heard, and we'll move on here to some other things, but I've heard, the covering up thing as a first step is fascinating to me, because there's been so much, and this, again, bear with me, there's been so much interesting urban art that's been put up that has celebrated the history, that has marked some of the bad history of slavery and so on. I'm thinking some of the murals downtown, and there's a real opportunity as an interim step, and this is me speaking personally, to do something that's an interim step that's really interesting and that keeps the issue in the forefront, that isn't just putting chain link and plywood up, but is kind of marking the shift that people, by and large, seem to want to hear. And I think it's telling. I mean, you said rightly. I mean, 70% of the African American population. I can't imagine there's anyone in the African American population who wants to keep those statues up. I have heard from no one who wants to keep them white or black. I mean, it's interesting. It's been very different than what you see in some other cities where there's a lot of conflict. There hasn't seemed to be that here. I think it's also interesting. Somebody brought up to me the timing and the legalities of this. Once the legislature goes in session in January, they're the ones who eliminated the ability of cities to remove these. The legislature has a tremendous amount of power over cities in this country and cities in this state. And so if you wait for that waiver process, somebody pointed out to me, you also run the risk of getting into the new legislative session, and who knows what restrictions they might put on cities. So last thoughts, any other thoughts on that we didn't cover? We'll move on.
Governor Haslam was in town this week and was asked specifically about two things. Would he use his office to try to move up a meeting of the Tennessee Historical Commission, which is now scheduled for October, and that wouldn't even result in a final decision. That probably wouldn't be until February. And he said no, that he would not do that. He was also asked if there could be some kind of special session of the legislature to take up a possible repeal of the entire law, and he said no on that as well, but that he feels like there should be some pressure put on the legislature as well as the Historical Commission in other ways.
Yeah, all right. 10 minutes left here. We'll move on to some of the other things that have been going on. Probably the biggest news in some ways in terms of beyond the monuments and the statues is Elvis Presley Enterprises has proposed building a 6,000 to 7,000 seat arena in Whitehaven, right around the area of where they're doing all the work around Heartbreak, right? Yeah, where Heartbreak Hotel was, but on top of the millions and millions of dollars they've been spending there and a lot of public incentive money. It was kind of startling to me out of nowhere. Maybe other people knew this was in the works. And Burnell, I mean, just to frame it a little bit, this would, what people say is fill the gap between the Orpheum, which is about 2,000 to 3,000 seats, the FedEx Forum, which is what, 16,000 to 20,000 seats. Right. And right now that middle business, that middle concert business goes down to the Lander Center, DeSoto County. Memphis has been losing out on that. There's been talk about the Coliseum being renovated and it filling that gap. But it was a pretty powerful proposal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anybody that frequents concerts in this area understands the concert, particularly the concert entertainment scene, understands that that sweet spot. We got the Cannon Center, we got the Orpheum, and then you've got the FedEx Forum. And so there's really no in between for that 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 seat kind of deal. And we've literally been hemorrhaging resources down to South Haven when you not only talk about the concerts and the events that go there, but the residual, which is the people that go to bars and restaurants and so forth, before and after those events. So for Elvis Presley Enterprises, a private entity, to be able to do this on private property and develop it makes sense, because then you can get around the whole, the Grizzlies clause, if you will, the sort of non-compete kind of thing, or first right of refusal, which I think is ingenious, and it really will be, people like Fred Jones, a longtime promoter here, is very much in favor of it. I mean, I think it's really a huge step that will help in the continued development of the Whitehaven area. Yeah,
because it's more, Bill, not just about the arena itself. At least Elvis Presley Enterprises is billing it as something that, this will be good for Whitehaven. They're even proposing that $1 of every ticket, I think it is, will go back to EDGE, the Economic Development and Incentive Agency, for specific programs within the Whitehaven area. Right. Your thoughts, again, on Elvis Presley Enterprises launching an arena in Memphis? This was,
Graceland probably has a lot more plans in the wings, but the nature of dealing with Graceland, even at this stage, is that it keeps these under wraps pretty well. So the idea of a 6,000 seat arena, by the way, an arena which could be adaptable for basketball games as well.
Which could be I mean, we're speculating here, but it could be the D-League team that the Grizzlies now have, and they're going to be playing at the Lander Center. The Memphis Hustle now could be actually in Memphis.
The idea of doing this, I don't think anyone beyond those involved in the planning had really thought broadly about what if we did an arena in Whitehaven.
Yeah.
It was always, well, if the Coliseum's renovated, but there's a block on this. So this is indeed a pretty bold solution to this problem. And it also takes Graceland out of the kind of Graceland bubble that it's in. And Graceland has been dipping its toe in this because they did Joe Walsh at the much smaller theater at the Guest House at Graceland, their resort hotel, earlier this year, right after they opened. So clearly they've been thinking about this.
It is part, we were talking, I don't know if you want to pipe in on this, Michaela, but we were talking a little bit before the show that, I've been to the Graceland area more, you and I were saying, since they opened Heartbreak Hotel, than in the previous however many years. I mean, just because Memphians don't necessarily go to Graceland. It's not that they don't like it, it's just, it's a tourist attraction. Heartbreak Hotel, there's lots of civic events, there's luncheons.
The Guest House.
Guest House, sorry, excuse me, thank you. The Guest House. Now you've got an arena there that might have everything from shows to conventions and so on, and it does have this appeal to Memphians, and then you've got the whole Whitehaven area that has seen some investment and so on. But your thoughts, Michaela, and also, what does this now do, and we're just speculating, to proposals to save the Coliseum? Because it would, if it gets approved, it's going to take, there's not going to be another 5,000 seat arena that the city's going to want to support in the middle of Memphis. I can't imagine.
Sure, yeah, and those are going to be two very interesting things to watch develop. Yes, like how is this going to affect the Coliseum? That's certainly going to take some wind out of its sails, I would imagine. I would just guess ahead. So we certainly want to keep our eyes on that. I don't know, in the absence of the Coliseum being able to fill that specific demand, I don't know how they're going to rebuild that push necessarily. And also with this arena, it's going to be, like you said, Memphians don't typically wander off to Graceland. I haven't been since I was 5. So I'm very curious to see this area. Are we going to see a lot of dollars being generated from Memphians going back into the neighborhood? Is it going to be that type of economic cycling?
And certainly you think, and then we'll move on a little bit, but, just anecdotally, people who go down to Landers, I know lots and lots of people who go down there, but it's out of the range of Memphis restaurants. It's out of the range of any kind of taxi or really reasonable taxi or Uber or Lyft type service. I mean, it really does change people's calculations in terms of, and you also start to think of people, hey, I'll take a weekend trip or a overnight trip or a couple day trip because I'm going to be in a destination. I'm not just going to be in the middle of Mississippi. There's nothing wrong with the middle of Mississippi. It's just a little different. It was also interesting, just real quickly, the tourism numbers from the state came out this week, and they talked about a $3.3 billion impact of tourism on Memphis, almost 23,000 jobs, and $260 million in state and local taxes that were generated, which I think was a record in 2016. And I think Bill Haslam highlighted that when he was in town this past week. I'll move on to, with just 4 or 5 minutes left, another big proposal that came out, which is the Wonder Bread redevelopment in right off the, it's the old Wonder Bread building, right off the Memphis Medical District, where there's a whole lot of development being planned and talked about. But this, I don't know who wants to talk about. You want to start here? Yeah. It's a big and impressive, one more big and impressive redevelopment of an area that has been abandoned as long as I can remember.
Yeah, it's about a 70...
Even when the Wonder Bread factory was there, it was kind of abandoned.
I miss the smell of bread.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, this is a $73 million project that is centered on the old bakery property, but also involves other properties as well. It's mixed use. We live in the age of mixed use now, and it would better define this area between the medical district and downtown Memphis that's been called the Edge for quite a while now. But you talk about a catalyst, this is also a catalyst. You consider that the facility that Graceland's talking about building is a $40 million facility that would also have some retail and some other uses, but mainly be an arena. Well, this is $73 million. And the impact on that, when you combine it with the Commercial Appeals footprint, just maybe a block away, being on the block now for sale as well, this is an area that is going to see a lot of transformation pretty quickly.
It brings up, and I should have said with the Whitehaven, or the Elvis Presley Arena proposal, it gets into the whole tax incentive thing. We had the tax incentive folks on a week or two ago. Your thoughts, Brunel, in terms of the appropriate use of public money and the tax incentives and back loans for a parking garage and all the different things that go into this.
Exactly. Well, I think the approach that Graceland has taken is fairly smart. Of course, they were already approved for a TIF district, tax incremental financing, and that was at a sort of 50% click. They want to increase that to 65, but they also are cognizant about allocating, as you mentioned, a portion of resources to go back into redevelopment to help smaller businesses in the area. I think those kinds of approaches are super smart. I think a lot of people are sort of leery of continuing to put big tax incentives into these huge projects and using public dollars to finance private projects. But I think some of them are being done smartly, and I think their approach is a good one.
Your thoughts on this, Michaela? I mean, just in terms of High Ground does really interesting reporting on all kinds of neighborhoods and areas and redeveloped areas. Do these, I don't know how to frame the question, but do these sort of big ticket, investments, Crosstown is one that obviously went online officially. It's been open for a while, but officially, celebrated its opening this past week. Does the Wonder Bread facility, does it reach out to all of Memphis, or is it, the stereotype of just a bunch of bearded hipsters who drink beer in a new area? I mean, does it hit all of Memphis? Do these projects have the kind of impact that the backers claim they will have?
Time will tell. I do think that one thing to keep close watch on as these projects come to light is, are they going to move the needle on contracts with minority and women-owned businesses? That's certainly one area we can look at to see, is this actually touching all of Memphis? Because as we know, those contract numbers are dismal. They're really, really bad. So kind of taking out the question of beards and beer and is this going to reach to everyone, that's certainly one metric to look at, I think. And otherwise, we'll see, of course, really just what kind of demographic is that going to bring to this area? Yeah. There's no way to tell just yet.
It's interesting. I was at the grand opening kind of celebration for Crosstown, which was a blighted, really kind of partly abandoned area. And it is interesting, I mean, how they claimed and they tried, and the Church Health Center and all the other people involved, they wanted to be diverse, they wanted to be economically diverse, they wanted to be racially diverse. To walk around is to see a place that is incredibly diverse, and they pulled that off. But then you wonder, does that have, I mean, people talk about their property values around there going up. Right. Does that then price people out, white or black, but who just can't afford to live in an up and coming neighborhood? I mean, it always reminds me when people talk about we need more growth, we need more development, which we do because that's jobs and so on, but sometimes there are ramifications on that not everyone has necessarily thought through. Really quickly, some political news, Bill, just briefly.
Joy Tuliados, the juvenile court clerk, has declared that she's going to be running for county mayor in the Republican primary next May. You'll see some other moves coming up on that as we get around Labor Day.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.